Somewhere beneath the official timelines, something feels unfinished. Civilizations appear fully formed, then vanish, leaving silence where continuity should be, as if memory itself were interrupted. Stone remembers floods, ice remembers fire, myths remember what archives forget. If history is a straight line, why does it keep breaking, restarting, erasing its own footsteps? Tonight, let the mind loosen its grip on certainty. Let questions drift slowly, like sediment settling after a long-forgotten catastrophe. We will not rush toward answers. We will listen to the gaps, the pauses, the places where time seems to inhale and never quite exhale. Stay with the silence and follow it. There is a discomfort that settles in when the timeline feels too clean. The stones speak of age, yet the records speak of sudden beginnings. Cities rise in the archaeological layers not as children learning to walk, but as adults stepping fully clothed into existence. Writing systems appear with grammar already complex. Astronomy arrives with calendars already precise. Architecture emerges with proportions already mastered. Between the silence and the sophistication, something feels missing, like a breath that was taken but never released. Long before modern chronologies were standardized, ancient cultures whispered of worlds before their own. In Mesopotamian tablets, kingship was said to have descended from the heavens, not metaphorically, but as a literal transfer of order after a great disruption. In Egypt, priests spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, a distant age when gods ruled openly and knowledge flowed without obstruction. In India, the Yuga cycles described vast ages collapsing and renewing, not once but repeatedly, each reset less luminous than the last. These stories do not read like isolated fantasies. They echo one another across continents that, according to conventional history, should not have been speaking at all. Geology adds its own quiet unease. Beneath the soil of settled civilizations lie abrupt scars, meltwater pulses, ash layers, sudden shifts in sediment that suggest violent transitions rather than gentle evolution. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose with startling speed. Coastlines vanished. Entire ecological systems were rewritten. If human societies existed along those drowned shores, their traces would now sleep beneath hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of casual excavation, preserved not in libraries but in pressure and darkness. What remains above water appears fragmented. Megalithic structures scattered across the globe share mathematical relationships that imply a sophisticated understanding of geometry and astronomy. The precision of certain stone cuts challenges assumptions about primitive tools. The alignment of ancient sites with solstices and equinoxes suggests not experimentation, but inherited knowledge. It feels less like invention, and more like remembrance, as though someone was rebuilding from a blueprint whose origin had already been lost. History, as it is commonly taught, prefers gradual ascent. It is comforting to imagine humanity climbing steadily upward from ignorance toward enlightenment. But the physical record does not always cooperate with that narrative. Instead, it offers intervals of brilliance followed by long shadows. Technologies disappear, techniques are forgotten, literacy collapses. Even myths seem to dim, shifting from accounts of direct interaction with higher forces into symbolic stories, and later into moral allegories stripped of their original context. One explanation is natural catastrophe. Ice sheets destabilize, volcanoes darken skies, meteor impacts rearrange climates. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, remain vulnerable to planetary moods. Another explanation is social collapse, where complexity becomes too fragile, too centralized, too dependent on systems that fail once pressure is applied. Knowledge then retreats into smaller circles, guarded, encoded, or abandoned altogether. Over generations, what was once practical becomes sacred, then mythical, then dismissed as superstition. Yet there is another possibility that lingers at the edge of comfort, that history is not only broken by disaster, but edited afterward. That after each reset, survivors reorganize not just infrastructure, but memory itself. Victors define origins. Institutions preserve what serves stability. Dangerous knowledge, or destabilizing reminders of previous peaks, are reframed or erased. Over time, the absence feels natural. The gaps stop calling attention to themselves. The idea of multiple civilizational resets does not require a lost super-empire or fantastical machines. It only requires acknowledgement that human capacity has risen and fallen more than once, that progress is not a straight line but a tide, advancing and retreating, leaving debris that future generations struggle to interpret. What looks like a miracle of sudden genius may instead be the faint afterglow of something older, dimmed by trauma and time. As centuries pass, each reset tightens the narrative. The distant past becomes smaller, flatter, more manageable. Chronologies shrink, ages compress. What cannot be easily categorized is set aside. The official story becomes smoother, easier to teach, easier to believe. Meanwhile, the anomalies remain, quiet but persistent, waiting for minds willing to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it too quickly. There is a peculiar humility that emerges when continuity is questioned. If civilizations have risen and fallen repeatedly, then permanence is an illusion. Knowledge is not owned, only borrowed. Memory is fragile. What feels unprecedented may be repetition wearing a new mask, and what feels stable may already be dissolving, imperceptibly, beneath familiar routines. The first reset may not be a single event but a pattern, repeated until it becomes invisible. A forgetting so complete that even the act of forgetting is forgotten. What remains are symbols, ratios, myths, and stones, scattered like breadcrumbs that no longer point clearly in one direction. To follow them requires patience rather than certainty, listening rather than concluding. The silence between epochs grows heavier the longer it is ignored. It presses not with fear, but with invitation. Something is being suggested, not declared. That history, rather than a finished book, may be a palimpsest, written over again and again, each layer faintly visible beneath the next. And if this is true, then the question is not how many times civilization has reset, but how close we might be to recognizing the pattern before it turns once more. The trail does not end here. It only fades, just enough to make the next step uncertain, just enough to ensure that whatever comes next cannot be approached with the same assumptions carried in at the beginning. What survives a collapse is rarely what mattered most. Fire consumes libraries faster than temples. Floods erase neighborhoods before monuments. The everyday knowledge that sustains a civilization often vanishes first, while stone symbols endure, stripped of their original meaning. This imbalance creates a peculiar illusion for those who arrive later, an impression that ancient societies were obsessed with ritual while lacking practical sophistication, when the truth may be that practicality simply does not fossilize well. After the first great discontinuity, whatever its precise cause, the human story appears to contract. Settlements become smaller, trade routes shorten, artistic styles simplify. The long-distance coherence that once linked distant regions weakens, replaced by local survival strategies. This period is often described as a dark age, but darkness can be misleading. It was not an absence of intelligence, but an absence of continuity. Knowledge was no longer cumulative. Each generation rebuilt from fragments, not foundations. Oral tradition becomes dominant in these intervals, not because writing was unknown, but because materials, institutions, and stability required to maintain archives were no longer reliable. Stories carried information that could survive displacement. Myths encoded astronomical cycles, agricultural timing, ethical constraints, and warnings about forces larger than human ambition. Over time, repetition softened precision. Metaphor replaced measurement. What was once instruction slowly became allegory. In this contraction phase, symbols proliferate. Spirals, serpents, world trees, flood narratives, descending ages. These images appear independently across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Their persistence suggests that they were not inventions of leisure, but mnemonic anchors for something once understood more concretely. When exact knowledge can no longer be transmitted, pattern remains, shape remains, rhythm remains. The second reset may not announce itself with catastrophe alone, but with reinterpretation. As societies stabilize again, they attempt to organize memory. Priestly classes, early scholars, and ruling elites begin to curate the past. Lineages are established. Origin stories are formalized. The chaotic inheritance of the collapse is smoothed into genealogies that emphasize legitimacy and divine sanction. What does not fit is quietly sidelined. This is where loss becomes selective. Certain ideas persist because they reinforce hierarchy or cohesion. Others fade because they imply cycles rather than progress, impermanence rather than destiny. The concept that civilization has already risen and fallen before is destabilizing. It undermines claims of chosenness. It weakens the authority of the present. So the past is reframed as primitive, the future as linear ascent. Archaeology sometimes brushes against this tension. Layers reveal abrupt transitions. Tools appear out of sequence. Techniques emerge without clear precursors. The academic response is often caution, which is reasonable, but caution can harden into resistance when anomalies accumulate faster than explanations. The narrative is protected not by malice, but by habit. Once a framework becomes dominant, evidence is unconsciously filtered to preserve it. The third reset unfolds quietly within thought itself. As writing returns, it does not restore what was lost. It replaces it. New scripts encode new priorities. Measurement systems change. Calendars reset their 0 points. History begins again, this time with clearer dates but shorter memories. Earlier epochs are compressed into mythological time, safely distant and conveniently vague. This intellectual reset is subtle but profound. It teaches societies to look forward rather than backward. Progress becomes a moral good. Forgetting becomes adaptive. The ruins beneath one's feet are acknowledged but not interrogated too deeply. They are attributed to ancestors who were simpler, not to predecessors who may have been different in ways that challenge modern assumptions. Across continents, similar patterns repeat. Civilizations flourish, centralize, and grow confident in their permanence. They build monuments to time itself, inscribing stone with the belief that memory can be fixed, and then pressure accumulates. Environmental shifts, internal complexity, external conflict. The system strains. When it breaks, it does so unevenly, preserving symbols and losing context once again. What remains after multiple resets is not a straight story, but a rhythm. Expansion, contraction, reinterpretation. Each cycle leaves behind echoes that later generations mistake for origins. The idea of a single dawn of civilization becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when the record is viewed as layered rather than linear. By this stage, the question of how many resets have occurred becomes less important than recognizing their effects. Shortened timelines, isolated achievements, recurring myths of decline from a golden age, persistent anxiety about forgetting something essential. These are psychological fossils, impressions left by repeated encounters with loss. The past, in this view, is not a foundation, but a depth. The deeper one looks, the less solid it becomes, dissolving into overlapping attempts to begin again. Each reset narrows the aperture through which memory can pass. Each restart feels original to those inside it. The amnesia is nearly complete. Nearly, but not entirely. Something continues to surface, quietly resisting erasure. Ratios carved into stone, stories that refuse to stay symbolic, alignments that only make sense if someone long ago was paying very close attention to the sky. These remnants do not shout. They wait. As the second part of the trail fades into the third, the sense grows that resets are not accidents but features of the human experiment. That civilization, like consciousness itself, may oscillate between awareness and forgetting. And that the most dangerous moment is not collapse, but the confidence that collapse belongs only to the distant past. By the time memory has been rewritten more than once, forgetting becomes indistinguishable from truth. What remains is not deception in the dramatic sense, but compression. Vast stretches of human experience are folded inward, reduced to symbols small enough to carry forward without destabilizing the present. This is where the third reset leaves its deepest mark, not in stone or ash, but in the architecture of thought itself. In this phase, civilizations regain confidence. Trade networks widen again, mathematics refines itself. Writing systems become efficient, abstract, capable of administration rather than remembrance. The past is no longer a warning whispered through myth, but a resource to be managed. Dates are standardized. Kings anchor themselves to chosen ancestors. Chronology becomes an instrument of power. defining where legitimacy begins and where it is not allowed to reach. The earlier worlds do not vanish completely. They are reframed. The age before becomes a prelude, primitive and incomplete, useful only as contrast. Flood stories lose their specificity and become moral lessons. Ancient teachers become gods, then metaphors. What once described survival through catastrophe is repurposed to instruct obedience, humility, or faith. The emotional residue remains, but the factual core dissolves. This is also the age in which knowledge fragments by discipline. Astronomy separates from myth. Geometry separates from ritual. Sound, symbol, number, and structure drift apart, studied in isolation rather than as expressions of a single worldview. Something subtle is lost in this division, a sense that reality once appeared coherent rather than categorized. The earlier civilizations may not have known more facts, but they may have perceived more connections. The monuments from deeper time now appear enigmatic rather than familiar. Their builders are credited with devotion, not calculation. Their alignments are admired but rarely internalized. Precision becomes an accident instead of an inheritance. When explanations fail, reverence fills the gap. Sacred replaces technical. Mystery replaces memory. As empires rise, they absorb what they can use and discard the rest. Libraries grow, but selection is constant. Copying is preservation, but also filtration. Texts are summarized. Contradictions are harmonized. Chronologies are reconciled by omission rather than expansion. Over generations, the past becomes smoother, quieter, easier to carry. This smoothing effect creates a peculiar blindness. Evidence of interruption is everywhere, but interpreted locally rather than systemically. A ruined city is explained by war, a vanished culture by assimilation, a sudden leap in knowledge by genius. The possibility that these are fragments of a much larger pattern rarely takes hold, because it would require accepting that stability itself is temporary. The third reset does not erase civilization, it narrows it. It teaches societies how to forget efficiently. Progress accelerates, but depth diminishes. Innovation thrives, but origin becomes shallow. Humanity moves forward quickly, unburdened by too much memory, unaware that speed itself can be a form of vulnerability. Meanwhile, the planet continues its own rhythms, indifferent to human narratives. Climate shifts quietly, magnetic fields wander, solar cycles pulse. None of this appears dramatic on the scale of a single lifetime, but over centuries it accumulates. Civilizations adapt, assuming continuity, mistaking resilience for immunity. At this stage, the idea of earlier resets survives only at the edges, in heterodox philosophies, in marginalized texts, in symbols repeated without explanation. The mainstream story no longer has room for repetition. History becomes a staircase, not a wave. Each step upward is treated as final. Yet the signs persist, techniques that appear too early, knowledge that seems to arrive fully formed, cultural memories of ages when humans were closer to something lost. These are treated as curiosities rather than clues. The possibility that civilization is cyclical remains emotionally distant, even as the material record quietly supports it. The third reset therefore completes a psychological transformation. Humanity no longer expects forgetting, it assumes accumulation. The future is imagined as endless extension rather than fragile balance. This assumption reshapes behavior. Systems grow more complex, dependencies deepen, redundancy fades, efficiency replaces resilience. From within this mindset, collapse becomes unthinkable until it arrives. Warnings are reinterpreted as metaphors. Anomalies are isolated. The notion that earlier worlds may have reached comparable heights and then fallen is dismissed as pessimism or fantasy. Confidence becomes the dominant mood, and yet beneath this confidence there is an undercurrent of unease, a recurring sense that something essential has slipped away, a nostalgia without a clear object, a fascination with origins paired with discomfort when those origins refuse to stay simple. This unease leaks into art, philosophy, and dreams, hinting at a memory that is not personal, but collective. As the third reset settles into normalcy, it creates the conditions for the next, not through failure alone, but through success, through growth that forgets its own limits, through stories that reassure rather than caution, through a past that has been edited until it no longer warns. The path forward narrows again, almost imperceptibly. The rhythm continues, unnoticed by those living inside it, and somewhere, beneath the layers of certainty, the pattern prepares to repeat, not as an echo of the first time, but as a quieter, more refined forgetting, waiting for the moment when memory once again becomes too heavy to carry. After forgetting becomes efficient, forgetting becomes invisible. This is the phase where the fourth reset does not arrive as shock, but as normalization. Civilization continues outward, confident, interconnected, increasingly abstracted from the conditions that once shaped it. Memory has been streamlined, complexity is celebrated, fragility hides inside elegance. In this stage, humanity believes it has finally escaped the cycle. Scientific language replaces myth, offering precision where symbolism once lived. Measurements become more accurate. Instruments extend perception beyond the senses. Time is quantified, space is mapped, matter is dissected. The universe appears intelligible, governed by laws that promise predictability. The old stories of collapse begin to sound archaic, artifacts of a superstitious past. Yet beneath this clarity, something subtle is lost. Knowledge becomes externalized, stored in systems rather than embodied in people. When understanding depends on infrastructure, its continuity depends on stability. The chain of transmission grows longer, more specialized, more brittle. Few understand the whole, most understand fragments. Coordination replaces comprehension. The fourth reset begins not with fire or flood, but with distance. Distance from land, from sky, from cycles once observed directly. Seasons become data points. Stars become coordinates. Earth becomes a resource rather than a partner. This distance is not malicious. It is efficient. It allows expansion at a scale previously impossible. It also dulls sensitivity to thresholds. History during this phase is rewritten with confidence. Earlier resets are reclassified as local failures rather than systemic ones. Collapse is treated as an exception, not a rule. Progress narratives harden. The idea that advanced societies could erase themselves becomes implausible, even embarrassing. The past is mined for inspiration, not instruction. Institutions grow powerful by managing complexity. Education fragments knowledge into disciplines. Expertise deepens while perspective narrows. The past is curated into museums and textbooks, stripped of ambiguity. What cannot be verified is sidelined. What does not fit models is postponed. Uncertainty becomes something to eliminate rather than contemplate. At the edges, anomalies persist. Sudden cultural leaps. Technologies that appear without clear lineage. Structures whose precision still resists simple explanation. These are admired aesthetically, but rarely allowed to challenge the underlying framework. Wonder is permitted. Discomfort is not. The fourth reset is therefore quiet, internal, structural. It is a resetting of attention. Humanity stops listening for echoes. It assumes the present is unique. This assumption reshapes priorities. Speed overtakes durability. Optimization overtakes redundancy. Systems interlock so tightly that failure propagates faster than awareness. Environmental signals grow more complex as well. Not singular catastrophes, but layered pressures, shifting climates, resource depletion, subtle instabilities that do not announce themselves clearly. Each signal alone appears manageable. Together, they form patterns that are harder to perceive from within specialization. This is where the illusion of control becomes strongest. Models predict trends. Technologies promise adaptation. Risk is calculated, insured, deferred. The possibility of comprehensive reset feels abstract, theoretical, safely distant. Confidence becomes cultural gravity, pulling interpretation toward reassurance. Meanwhile, the remnants of earlier worlds remain scattered, patient. Not as warnings carved in stone, but as absences, missing transitions, gaps where continuity should exist. These absences are rarely foregrounded. They require synthesis rather than analysis, patience rather than proof. They remain peripheral, waiting. As networks expand, interdependence deepens, local resilience weakens, A failure in one domain ripples outward. The system gains reach but loses slack. The margin for error thins, unnoticed because efficiency feels like strength. The fourth reset does not erase memory outright. It buries it beneath confidence. It teaches civilization to trust its tools more than its intuition, its projections more than its past. It reframes caution as pessimism. It reframes humility as doubt. And yet, beneath this forward momentum, the old rhythm continues. Expansion without remembrance has its own inertia. It moves quickly, smoothly, until it does not. When strain exceeds adaptation, the system does not gradually adjust. It snaps into another configuration. What follows is not immediately visible as reset. It arrives as disruption, then reorganization. Narratives adjust. Blame localizes. The larger pattern remains unnamed. Each collapse is treated as singular, unprecedented, avoidable next time. This refusal to see repetition is the true inheritance of the fourth reset. Civilization has become skilled at rebuilding, but resistant to recognizing cycles. It carries forward more data than ever before, yet less wisdom about impermanence. As this phase settles, the sense grows that something is approaching, not dramatically, but inevitably. Not because of prophecy, but because of rhythm. The pattern does not hurry. It does not warn loudly. It waits for conditions to align, as they always have. And in the quiet between confidence and strain, the question that is never asked becomes heavier than any answer. What arrives after repetition is not clarity, but a thinning of illusion. By the time the sixth reset completes its work, civilization no longer collapses into emptiness. It collapses into familiarity. The structures change, the language shifts, the tools evolve, yet the underlying gestures feel uncannily known. Rebuilding begins almost immediately, not because memory survived intact, but because the pattern has been rehearsed so many times that it no longer requires explanation. In this phase, humanity carries forward immense technical capability alongside a deep uncertainty about meaning. Knowledge is abundant, yet orientation feels fragile. The archives are vast, but coherence is rare. Information multiplies faster than understanding can settle. The surface appears saturated while depth quietly erodes. The sixth reset does not remove complexity. It amplifies it until complexity itself becomes the burden. Systems no longer fail from scarcity alone, but from excess. Too many connections, too many dependencies, too much speed. Collapse arrives not as a singular rupture, but as cascading simplification, layers falling away until something workable remains. What survives is uneven. Certain skills endure because they are immediately useful. Others vanish because they require context that no longer exists. Entire domains of understanding dissolve without spectacle. The loss is quiet, noticed only in hindsight, when something once assumed to be permanent can no longer be recovered. In the aftermath, the story narrows again. Timelines compress. The distant past becomes abstract. Earlier resets blur together, their distinctions irrelevant to those focused on immediate reconstruction. The narrative begins anew, confident in its modernity, unaware that it is standing on the faint outline of many forgotten beginnings. This is where the notion of a seventh age begins to form, not as prophecy, but as inference. After enough cycles, a subtle awareness emerges, less conscious than instinctive. A feeling that something fundamental has been circling unresolved. That repetition itself may be pointing toward a threshold rather than an endless loop. The seventh age is not defined by technology or catastrophe. It is defined by relationship, by whether memory can finally become integrated rather than accumulated, by whether knowledge can remain embodied rather than externalized, by whether civilization can recognize its own rhythm without needing to relive it again. In this age, the old fragments take on new weight. Myths are no longer dismissed as fiction, nor treated as literal history, but approached as compressed experience. Stones are no longer admired only for their craftsmanship, but listened to for their silence. Gaps in the record are no longer smoothed over, but held open as meaningful spaces. This does not guarantee permanence. Nothing in the pattern suggests immunity, but it suggests a different posture, one that values resilience over expansion, remembrance over novelty, continuity over acceleration. The seventh age, if it emerges at all, does so quietly, without banners or declarations. It is an age that does not imagine itself as final. It does not claim to be the pinnacle. It understands that endings and beginnings are often the same moment, seen from different angles. It carries forward the awareness that civilization is not a destination, but a practice, renewed daily or abandoned without drama. In this awareness, history softens, not into comfort, but into humility. The past is no longer a ladder beneath the present, nor a graveyard behind it. It becomes a field of echoes, each one reminding the listener that survival has always depended less on dominance than on attention. The seventh age does not erase the six before it. It absorbs them, unevenly, imperfectly. Their mistakes remain possible, their insights remain fragile. Nothing is resolved. Something is simply noticed. And so the story does not conclude with an answer, but with an image. Civilization as a long tide, advancing and retreating across the same shore, leaving different patterns each time, yet shaped by the same moon. The water forgets its previous reach, but the shoreline remembers. In the quiet between waves there is a chance, not to stop the ocean, but to stand differently when it returns,